I say thank you everybody for joining us today. I guess the first question and the first discussion point today, until I've got Claire up and running and making sure that she's her audio and things is all working all right, because we seem to be having a couple of technical issues. I appreciate the weather probably isn't helping. Claire, can you hear me okay? No, maybe not. Sorry about this, everybody. Would anybody kind of like to kick off the conversation, I guess, in terms of, is anybody in a business that has merged or is in a business which has gone through a merger and they've felt that there's been an impact on kind of the customer service within that all? Claire, can you hear us okay now? No,
I can. Yeah, sorry, it was just a little bit slow to all load. How's that for everyone? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's a little bit laggy, but we've just about got you okay. So lovely to have you with us today. I mean, what was I was just trying to explain to everyone, but it's far better now you're here, to do kind of your introduction, I guess, why you wanted to bring this conversation to the table today.
Yeah, I think for me it's an interesting area. It's something I've got experience of at operational level. I've worked in organisations where I've been part of a large organisation that's effectively merged with quite a small one, and it's been in essence swallowed up that organisation. I've also been part of organisations where it's two organisations of similar size. I'm now currently a non-exec at quite a very small local organisation. So the whole sort of element of customer service and I suppose the difference between the large and small organisations, but certainly in the context of mergers and acquisitions and with what the sector is facing going forward in terms of challenges, you know, I think it's a really interesting area, and I thought I'd have and be part of.
I'm losing you a little bit, Claire, but I definitely kind of can get the point you're making there. In terms of how you've seen that, I kind of, I guess that culture shift is the big thing, isn't it, that you've noticed in terms of that impact. So do you feel now that having merged, you are further away from your customers than you were before? Or do you think actually that merger was, with, I guess, the additional funds and things that have come through, been beneficial for customers?
At the moment, just to be clear, sorry, we've not been through any sort of merger or not planning to really at this point. The organisation, I'm now a non-exec of, so just to be absolutely clear on that, this is a historical thing that I have been part of. But certainly when I, was part of a larger organisation, it was something that on the ground operationally, you did hear customers that sense of remoteness, and I think that's a lot of organisations fear. The organisation has got much more remote. Customers were used to a much more localised service, so our income area, and they used to have officers coming and knocking on the door, seeing them face to face, and suddenly they were having to contact a large nationalised contact centre.
Sorry, Claire, really losing you here. I don't know if anyone else, whether it's just me. Yeah, sorry, Claire, missed a lot of that. It seems that the signal, I appreciate it's probably the weather is having a...
Actually can be really, I think that's really where the debate comes. So it'd be interesting to hear what have they had experience and what are their thoughts around it.
Is it just me that's lost Claire there, or did other people pick up and they were okay there?
No, it keeps going in and out, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. I was like, I didn't know if it was my signal. I wasn't sure what's happening. Sorry, Claire. Keep just missing out what you're saying there, which is a real shame. But yes, Nigel was just put in the chat there. Is this a scaling issue? Nigel, would you be happy to kind of come in and expand on that one a little bit?
Yeah, hi. I just wondered, because I've had the experiences as being a customer. We went from a small to a large, and everything you said there, Claire, rings true, where basically everybody is in a virtual environment, hard to get hold of. But I wondered if there'd been any experiences of small to medium or small to small. that negates what you've basically said there, Claire? From anybody, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, I've personally, sorry, I was just going to say, I've been in a position in another job where it was two medium-sized, quite similar, and I would say yes, if things are done quite well, I think it can work. There was no loss of identity for the both of the businesses, so it was more of a sort of a group structure. So customers still had the same local line, they still had people going out to see them who they were familiar with, and it was managed in a much more careful and sort of slower steps. And that was a completely different experience operationally for me as an officer as well. So I think that, it's how it's managed, isn't it, really? And it's the aligning of the cultures and what the balance of power is between the two organisations. I think that's a key thing when this type of thing unfolds, and it's how it's managed from the top sort of downwards, really, isn't it?
Thank you.
Nigel.
Yeah, and the other thing that I kind of know going from small to large is I've asked a large organisation if they did a due diligence. Now, because I've worked in mergers and acquisitions in a different field, I know how important it is to look at all the factors factually rather than fictionally, so that the larger organisation in this case knows what they're getting into operationally there, Claire. And I've noted with my organisation, the large one, who I asked this question, that they actually didn't. In fact, they had not. They'd just taken the statements, the annual reports as fact, which was not reality. So the due diligence is an important aspect as well. Thank you.
I think that whole piece around kind of due diligence and understanding the culture of the business is certainly the when I've spoken with people, seem to be the biggest problems. And though we had Jo Leckie with us, unfortunately she's had to go. But when I know her kind of specialism is in that customer service piece, and I guess the question is how do we? Someone put actually up on the LinkedIn post I made the other day saying the mergers aren't essential in the sector and they're not as needed as people are saying that they are, and yet other businesses are saying the only way we're going to survive is by going through a merger or amalgamating, I guess, with a bigger business. So I think that's obviously one key issue. But from those times where you've seen it firsthand in whatever kind of capacity that's been, Claire, what went wrong? What is it that needs to change now in order for, I guess, customers, because the mergers are just going to keep happening. They are. There's so much money, I guess, at the top of housing at the moment that they're going to keep happening. We can't stop that happening. So how do we keep in contact, in close touch with our customers whilst that's still on, while these mergers, I guess, are going to continue?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, first of all, I'd just pick up on the comment there that says, they're not necessary. I think that given what we're facing financially, I'm not sure that that's a realistic comment. I think that smaller organisations may find it is necessary in terms of survival. And interesting in terms of preparing for today, I was just having a look at sort of the development of new homes. It's going to be a real challenge, isn't it, in terms of business side. What can we actually achieve here? Is it maintaining upkeep of current properties, and can we keep the focus on development of new homes? We know there's a housing crisis. We know that it's necessary. Is that not part of the core function of organisations as well? And I think that in terms of that question's still going to be there, isn't it? I think in terms of just sort of moving on alongside from that, just to really, but what's going to be important, we've got, haven't we, in the white paper, the sort of the push on the co-regulation with customers and the satisfaction measures. And I think having customers involved and that communication early is going to be really important when it needs to happen. So that it's almost like that curve of change, isn't it? So what is it? You get the sort of the shock, what's the next one on the curve? I've got it noted down here, really, where they sort of go through it, but then it moves, doesn't it, to sort of acceptance and commitment to it. But it's kind of that you just need to help that curve along earlier on. Sort of in terms of organisations joining up as well, I think what's important is the considerations of the shared goals and visions. It's really important. I sort of alluded to it earlier, but that power sort of you know, it has to be almost a shared power. I think where there's one sort of organisation with more power in what's unfolding, that's where things potentially have the, you know, there's that potential for it to fail or not go as well as it should from a customer point of view. But, you know, open to comments, I guess, on that. I'm certainly no expert. As I say, it's an area of interest. So,
and you're certainly not alone in that.
There's a comment there, isn't there, Matt?
Yeah, so Liz Curtis mentioned there, we need to bear in mind that good customer service has a direct link to employee engagement and satisfaction. The key to keeping good customer service needs to be the employees and how they're feeling and treated. And certainly, I mean, you know, as those who know me here, you know, I've been doing recruitment in the social housing world for many, many years. And that's the key thing. The amount of people who are leaving large organisations at the moment because they don't feel they fit in with the culture that exists in the company anymore. And that change that people have gone through, because if they don't feel they're close to the customer, they kind of question why they're in the business at all. Michelle, lovely to have you with us. Do come in.
Thanks, Matt. Claire, I think you've hit the nail on the head there about the communication level. And it is about getting that message right, because when people see a restructure, they are concerned about their jobs, and that's coming from a sense of fear. And Nigel mentioned earlier about that due diligence and the fact that, you know, sometimes that information actually isn't there and it can be overinflated. You've also got two organisations where people have been there for quite some time, and there's hidden loyalties, there's unspoken rules. And again, I think it's coming from that sense of fear, and people don't feel that they belong in that joined up organisation. And I've been through a few mergers. The first one, well, the second one that I went through, it was really done fantastically. And that's because the communication level. And then I've been into another organisation where they'd merged probably about 3 or 4 years previously. And the state of affairs, it was kind of still in a mess. Nobody knew what direction they were heading in. And I can't remember who it was, because you mentioned about that. It's like the norming, forming, storming and performing, because you will hit these different areas. Yeah. But yeah, it's a people business. So we've got to think about the people, haven't we?
We absolutely do.
I mean, one of the questions was about communication. What do you think is the best way to communicate all of this to the staff and the customers, because they're the people that keep the business going?
Any thoughts, Claire?
I think it's certainly I mean, for me, the key thing is this, isn't there? There's certain, obviously, you know, it's that balance of honesty and fear, I guess, as well, isn't there? You don't want to be too honest in terms of to ramp up fear too early, but, you know, if it's going to be restructuring potentially jobs, as Michelle was sort of alluding to a bit there is that fear factor, and I've certainly been part of that myself as well at another organisation. But I think it is being honest and transparent, but I think getting that message, what is the vision and what is the goal and what is going to be important to the new organisation, really. It's a new start, isn't it? So getting the right staff into the right places as well, because there is going to be elements of restructuring. So it's getting that person. When I saw it done quite well, it was done where we sort of worked down the levels of getting the right people in the right places, and messages moved along with that, and that seemed to work very well.
I think there's also an element there which is really important, and actually Alison has mentioned it in the chat about the size of merging organisations, and I know you mentioned it yourself there, especially where small or joins large one, because quite often you can see you've got directors or, you know, chief execs of smaller businesses that are the culture. I mean, end of the day, no matter what business you are, top down is your culture. Your culture, you can have whatever culture you want amongst your frontline or your staff as you go up, but it's your top down that redefine the culture of the organisation. And suddenly when they all leave because they're made redundant or whatever it will be, or they don't get positions in the new company, I think that sends a large message to, you know, to the business that they're now going to be a part of, that they're merging with, or being, you know, tutored across to. However, the people who are in the large business, obviously it isn't right that they just lose their roles, because they're already in place. So that's the difficult one. And I know people do talk about due diligence and the work that goes into it, but quite often that doesn't work from a purely customer service based perspective, because the goals of the size of the business are different. I'm just having a quick look through some of the chats here. So Liz has mentioned communicate early, clearly and regularly through trusted and recognised channels. And I think the challenge there is, if you're the business that I guess is being swallowed up, do you trust the larger business? How is that trust built? And that's going to be a key thing. And as Nigel's put, do not oversell and overpromise. It's always better to underpromise and overdeliver. Alison, you've mentioned there in the chat, I don't mind if it'd be great if you have to kind of come off mute for a second. You said, was also thinking access to services. What do you mean by that one, Alison? Oh, maybe not right this second.
You're right. It's just I'm not on my own. I'm hosting a warm bank for people to come in and out for hot drinks, so I can't really speak. I'm just removing myself from the room.
Okay.
No, I was thinking around. I know I've been part of a merger where a much smaller BME organisation was taken in, and they had like an office that was open regularly, and tenants were used to being able to go in and things, and the staff ratio was much smaller. And I know for me, like the involved customers we had, it was quite a different experience then suddenly being part of a big customer service unit going across the board. So it's not just that, I get what you're saying about the staff, but I think the tenants are used to it. The service is just, it's not necessarily better or worse, but it's very different and more, sometimes more front facing and just different. It's easier for staff might have more personal knowledge of the different properties and tenants than they would in a big call centre sort of situation.
Makes sense. Claire, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just nodding along there, Alison. That's absolutely what I've sort of witnessed in one organisation, and I completely agree. But I think what's important, what you've said there, Alison, is it's different. So it's not necessarily better or worse. It's a different offering, and parts of that different offering might actually be beneficial to some parts of the customer base. So it's not necessarily always a negative thing. This sort of the different offering, it can actually be beneficial. And it was something I was sort of pondering in preparation for this morning, really, that actually the larger organisation often has lots of different points of contact, which actually might be quite convenient for a lot of the customer base. You know, not everybody wants to have to take the time out to have to go and visit the office or ring up. The fact that there now might be a better digital offering, you can transact quite quickly and more efficiently, might suit a lot of customers actually.
And things
but
like
you will hear the noise from the ones
and stuff like that, you know, the broader things and all that kind of support can be more in a bigger organisation. But I think there's, I don't know whether this happens very often.
And this is maybe just my perspective, but when mergers do happen, when you have a bigger organisation, patch sizes also grow. So I guess customers don't have as easy of access to their individual person. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Evidently, you know, housing is one of those sectors that does need to be as efficient as it can be with the funds and things available to it. But patch sizes, some of the ones you hear about are massive, 2,500 properties, 3,000 properties more. One person can't effectively manage that. They can manage it, but that's where you get issues like what happened with Peabody, because how someone was in their home dead for 2 years, I still can't quite fathom how that happened. And I know there's inquest and stuff going on with it, but if they weren't as big as they were, that never would have done. If they're a more community-based organisation, and I think a lot of people are trying to go back and work in community-based organisations as well. Nigel said in the chat there that honesty of benefit versus cons would help staff and customers. I guess though, on that, how honest are you? I suppose people always kind of go, if we do this, it is going to be great. I guess sometimes it's, how do you know how negatively it's going to affect you if you haven't done it before? I guess would be the flip to that question. Claire, I mean, I'm picking on yourself here. Do you think that some of those negatives can be seen before the merger happens, or do you just think it's a matter of people going, actually, this is going to be fine, and not realising it till too late?
I I mean, I think certainly with the local approach, I'd like to think that was obvious if you were sort of taking on a smaller organisation, you know, but it's how you mitigate that. Is it just a sort of something that's accepted when the process is going through? You know, I've not been sort of in that position. I've been more involved in the fallout as someone working operationally, but I'd sort of like to think if I did find myself in that sort of scenario, it would be something that you would think about and how you would mitigate that. But ultimately, if it was smaller to larger, how could you truly mitigate it? I'm not too sure. And would it be, I think, as Nigel's saying there, that you just would have to be quite honest with customers, but showing them the benefits and saying, well, we acknowledge this. You know, I'm not sure of the answer, if I'm honest. It's just sort of my thoughts there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Go on, Nigel.
Can I come in there, Claire, and just ask about that? I mean, what we were promised going from small to large was obviously the benefits of the larger organisation, which is one of the top 5 in the country. But what would have been really helpful, which they didn't actually be honest about, so that's why I was saying cons versus good things, is that basically nobody's around. It's not, and everybody will say this, there's no face-to-face, it's all kind of done remotely. And most of it gets lost. Now, this isn't a bashing, it's just reality that when you go from small to large, we all know what happens. And that's why I go back to that question about honesty. Okay, we can't anticipate everything, but I think some kind of clarity or transparency of what realistically people, and this applies to staff as well as customers, are likely to expect would be helpful. With some kind of, here's the other thing, with some kind of transition period, right? With some realistic transition period noted, things will be different. We've all said that before. Things will be different. Some will be better, some will be worse. But notification that change will happen and it will be a gradual process would also be helpful. So that's it. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Nigel. Richard, do come in.
Yeah, hi there, I'm Richard. I've been in social housing for about 30 years now, I think. I've had experience of working in smaller and larger merged organisations, got sort of quite a bit of experience. But my question, just sort of picking up on what Nigel just said there, was something around whether anyone's got experience of working for a merged organisation post the change to the involvement standard. Because I know the involvement standard changed sort of 2-3 years ago, where essentially, you know, if you're changing kind of housing management practices, then you have to make the case to residents as to what the benefit is. And I just wonder whether, you know, whether there's been any kind of experience of where promises or the case has been made to residents and whether the merged organisation has not delivered on that, or has delivered on that, and whether people think there needs to be an increased role for the regulator around holding merged organisations to account around those promises that are made under the involvement standard. I don't know whether the white paper or the you know, the social housing white paper sort of talks about that specifically, but I just wonder whether that's something that people have experience of.
Thank you, Richard. Claire, have you got anything on that one at all?
Not personal experience. I think it's a really good question, Richard, and it's something that's this is I guess why this, you know, the opportunity interested me, I guess, on that note. I think it's absolutely right. You know, the question about the regulator, I don't think specifically it's in the white. I'm not too sure if anyone would correct me, that's absolutely fine. I'm not too sure it's specifically addressed in there. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else has a specific experience or anything they can share.
Carolyn, do come in, please. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, sorry I was a bit late, folks.
Don't worry at all.
Hang on, something weird is popping up on my screen that I need to get rid of because I can't see anybody now. Bear with. Oh, now the phone's ringing. Can you believe it? It's all going wrong here at the moment. Bear with. I'll come back. You carry on.
I think Carolyn probably had an answer to your question there, Richard, so we'll come back to her in a moment. Richard, do come back in.
So just to be controversial, when I started my housing career 30 years ago, I was a housing officer, stroke rent collector, actually, in Whitney. And I had a patch of about 200 properties, 100 in Oxford and 100 in Whitney. I don't think that service model has been bettered in the last 30 years that I've been working in housing. I know that, you know, when I was part of a larger organisation and we merged with a couple of organisations, you know, part of the, there were some improvements, there were some things that were good about all of that. So I'm not totally negative or disparaging, but the main driver was around efficiency. And so what was created was kind of 2 levels of service delivery. There was a call centre where all of the kind of calls were handled centrally, and then it was handed off to various staff, with the idea being that if you've got the IT systems that back it up, then any member of staff can pick up the handoff, they can read the case and they can react. And the idea was that that would be a much more efficient way of delivering service to residents. Nonsense. In my view, just to be controversial, you can't
controversial is good on this table, Richard, so I'm glad for it.
You can't beat the generic housing officer, in my view. I don't think the service model has bettered that in the 30 years, because you build relationships with your residents, with your tenants and your leaseholders. You are the main point of contact for that community, and you can act as the conduit to arguing your case, making your case for what that community needs.
Do you think there's still an argument needed, Richard, for specialist, I guess, high level ASB or income?
Yeah, I think there's a case for that, where specialist interventions are required and cases get complicated. Then yes, absolutely, there is a case for the specialist worker. And also that helps to do the good cop, bad cop, you know, differentiate, helps you as the housing officer keep your relationships in the community, but you've got someone that can take the enforcement action, and it potentially doesn't then ruin your housing officer's relationships. So yeah, I think there is a space for kind of that good cop, bad cop relationship, and you know, I've been involved in that kind of setup where that's worked quite well. But I think that the issue really I have with large and merged organisations is the focus is always on efficiency, not customer service. Not always, but largely, and also, you know, you lose accountability. There's too many reasons or too many options or opportunities for that accountability chain to get lost, and that's where it breaks down.
And do you think that in a merged organisation you find that happens more or less than in a smaller community-based one, I guess?
Well, in my experience, I mean, you know, smaller community-based organisations aren't new, so they're absolutely not, but it's much easier to keep a handle on, I think. You know, you're
getting people in the chat completely back you. Alison Leach certainly has said that, you know, issues of complex needs, things get lost when 3 or 4 officers dealing should only be for complex cases. It's that issue, exactly what you said, actually, of ownership. And if someone going, yeah, I'm taking a handle on this, I think is often the issue. When you've got too many cooks, I guess, involved in that broth, it's that whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from what I see, you know, just kind of the whole kind of stuff that's going through the ombudsman's complaint stuff, all their kind of in-depth reviews, it's all around accountability. From what I see, it's basically things getting lost in the system, no one taking ownership, and it all just kind of going wrong, really. You know, like I say, when I started off as a rent collector, stroke housing officer 30 years ago, I kind of knew where the problems were with damp and mould in particular properties, because people came out of the street and grabbed me. It's like, yeah, come and look at this. And you are then, because you've seen it, you then have to take responsibility. But because you've got a smaller patch, you can take that responsibility to get it surveyed or whatever. And I just worry that we kind of lost the plot a little bit, really. And I'm overstating the case to make a point. But we kind of lost the plot because if you've got that local connection on the ground, to me, no system of call center or customer portal or whatever can replace that. It can complement it, sure, but nothing can replace that. And I think we seem to have lost sight of what's important in terms of delivering good old-fashioned nuts and bolts housing management.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree, and I think actually a lot of that comes down to size of the business again. And if you, I know it is business to business, but recently I did a big piece of work with Bromsgrove District Housing Trust, and they've got their housing officers, but they also recruited neighbourhood coaches, and their role was just to be out on site at all times and be that visualised person, because they know then people will approach them. And exactly what you were talking about there. Get back to doing the basics right. A couple of points in the chat, and I'm going to bring Carolyn back in. Mercy had mentioned there that when they're too big, they lose touch of what's real and not real as it relates to their customer service and well-being. We've seen that in the media. The conversation needs to be heard across the sector on how large is too large, particularly as they're promoting inclusive voice. Philip Thornton, instead of businesses focus on customer services, all businesses move away from customer services and have a customer engagement team to oversee customers. And I think that's a little bit kind of what Richard mentioned there, was when you engage fully with your community, services improve, and if you're too big, it's difficult to do that. And Chris Pope has mentioned that in 1999, at the start of his housing career, he was told there were no new ideas in housing, only recycled ones. Housing associations merge, get bigger, lose sight of their community to drive efficiency. But the patch-based generic housing officer is still the best model. I'm going to come back to Nigel's point in a minute, but Carolyn, thank you for being patient there. I hope the phone call was okay. Lovely to have you back with us.
Yeah, that's fine. It wasn't actually anybody there. It was just a beep beep noise. So that was ridiculous. Waste of time. I'm new to housing in compared to everybody else. I've only been involved in housing for 3 years. Previous to that, I came from a banking background and was involved in a merger between Lloyds Bank and TSB, which has now been reversed. So we now have Lloyds Bank and TSB as two separate entities. Not sure why that is, because I've been out of banking for a long time. But I think that it's a tricky thing. It's very fashionable to merge at the moment. There must be lots of decisions made in lots of different housing associations across the country on whether to do it or not to do it, and what the reason behind that is. And it just seems that everybody's going through this pain on their own, and there's no kind of like overall view of what a successful merger should include and what a successful merger outcomes should look like. So it's like, where's the best practice? Who's looking at this as a best practice model? Who's defining what should and shouldn't happen? Whereas each individual housing association and the staff within it and the customers of those housing associations have nothing to base what the perception of the outcomes is going to be on. There's no kind of blueprint, if that's the right word for it. I might be talking out of turn here, but it just strikes me that, we're supposed to be learning from each other and learning from that. Often it seems that we just work in our own silos, and it's the same with everything. It's like the tenant satisfaction measures, and it's like, we're all doing it all independently, and there's no kind of like joined up thinking. And it's not like we're in competition with each other. We're all trying to deliver the best customer service to our residents. So it's really odd for me, as a fairly new person to this sector, to see us all going through this pain on our own. But I suppose that's what this conversation is all about, in a way. I hadn't realised, because I'm fairly new, about the involvement standard, Richard, and I've just got that up on my screen and had a quick scan of it very quickly, the document. And we merged in, 2020, I think it was, a few months after I joined, and we had a tenant panel that were involved very closely with that merger decision making, and they helped to ease it through with our residents, our involved residents, because we're a community gateway housing association, and so we have tenants on the board and we have resident groups, and although that structure has changed slightly since we merged, it was very important to that process, you know, the merger process. So we went from sort of about 8,500 to nearly 13,000 homes in that merger. And I don't think on the grand scheme that's the hugest of housing associations, but I think Flagship, and I don't know if anyone is here from Flagship, got very big, and then they've split they seem to have split up into 3 separate named companies within that Flagship, under that Flagship umbrella. So I'm wondering whether it's just like the old Lloyds Bank TSB scenario, where we'll all get so big and then we'll realise that actually we really need to be a bit smaller and go back to where we were in the beginning. Anyway, there's my thoughts.
No, look, thank you so much. And I'm delighted you're here, because though you said you've only been here for 3 years, I want these roundtables, and when I set them up a couple of years ago, was for anybody from who's new to housing to who's been a chief exec for donkey's years to be A, welcome, and B, to bring a viewpoint to the table. Because something else you mentioned there, which is absolutely key, is that trust needs to be built amongst housing providers. I am the chair of a supported exempt accommodation forum in Birmingham, because similar to housing, not everyone trusts each other. They go, oh, well, are they actually doing things right? Or are they, oh, that isn't how we would do it. Oh, we won't talk and share ideas. We'll just carry on doing things our way. And the idea with these tables was to bring trust and make change, but definitely to bring people together every week. So delighted to have you with us. I love the idea of a blueprint. I think it's a really fair point. Like, who is actually doing it well is maybe a really interesting question. There are those that I know have grown together, and you know, I'll bring in Alison and Richard in a moment to discuss that further. But how big is too big? And the final point, I guess, was that point you made there at the end, which is about splitting into smaller. I think the key thing is that's what people want to work in. Not those who've been in housing for a long time don't want to work in just a place where it's so big they're just a number. They want to actually make a difference on the ground. And if it's too big, they're struggling to do that. Alison, I'm going to bring you in, then I'll be Richard, and then I'll jump back to the chat. So Alison, great to have you with us again.
Hi, yeah, just back to the patch size issue, because I'm sure Richard can tell from my nodding that I've been saying this for so. In my previous role, I was post Green Paper. I started developing a customer voice strategy, and it struck me when we were doing all the brainstorming and that around it, that most of the problems we faced, to me, thinking about how I operated in the early 90s, would have been solved by that. You know, all the things that get lost in various chains of command, you know, the repairs reporting. I mean, this is quite a controversial view, but I have a real issue with paying people 20-odd thousand a year on a call centre telephone to know that level of complexity and diversity of issues. We used to have a system of a duty officer who would be on the phone or the desk, who was actually a trained housing officer. There's a whole load of stuff here tied up with professionalism and the status of the profession. And I think call centres fine, you know, if you want to change your direct debit or something, but some of the conversations you hear from people, you know, I've spent 30 years learning this stuff. How can you expect someone to just, and the other thing I think is the more complex things get as well, in terms of we're having all this austerity and downturn, people with multiple issues. You know, it's that 80-20 thing. 20% of your customers are going to have a lot of call on your time. I mean, I do remember one organisation when call centres were first established. Most people go through that route, and then the housing officers focus on almost like supported living, maybe. And just a final kind of geographical point, and because I'm not currently working, I can say what I like, I think. But I think there's something to do with the geographical footprint in terms of patches, because the small community-based associations like I worked 4 years ago, we had the knowledge of the different agencies and the footprint on the ground. I think stock transfers, despite some of their failings, have got that. The ones I worry about are the ones, and we all know examples of it, where they've got 40 properties in this local authority and 20 in that one. And I don't think the model that Richard and I are talking about would necessarily work that well in that. And I don't know, but one time there was a lot of noise about stock rationalisation and bringing kind of that critical mass of properties back together. But I think that's another conversation that needs opening out. My other big hatred is you get these massive building sites and then 3 housing associations decide to manage the properties with all the different bureaucracy and policies, and it's just madness, and it's not value for money or streamlined service for the community either. Sorry, I know this was about mergers, but you've gone into my housing management rant, which anyone who knows me has heard at least 20 times before.
Well, I mean, the problem with that as well is that you have if you have got too many people involved, who do the customers know who to go to for their issue? I think that's the thing. Is actually a couple of points in the chat that came up before I bring Richard back in. Nigel had mentioned the conundrum with larger housing associations is delivering new regulation customer engagement standards. It's normally a resourcing issue, scaling up people to meet increased customer and increased demands and standards. And one thing I can absolutely tell you is there is a huge shortage of housing officers on the market at the moment. And people are spending big salaries now to secure housing officers because it's the only way they're doing it. At some point, something's going to have to change. And Michelle Haycock.
Perhaps I should go back to it at 53. You never know.
I can
do that. I told you so thing to everybody.
Well, genuinely, I was recruiting for housing officers week before last at 32,000. It's there are big salaries out there now because people are doing, and they're almost becoming more. They're calling them housing managers because they're managing properties rather than managing the community. But I'd say the community coach role that was being run by Bromsgrove, the adverts were up everywhere. That was in the region of 35,000, because again, it was being out and on the ground, and they understood the value of the role, and they'd rather have 2 or 3 of those than they would a head of service who, well, that isn't going to have as big an impact. And Michelle said, when the funding regime changed on new developments, housing associations became more competitive. And I think this is a key thing, is the larger housing associations to have more revenue for new build and acquisitions, so smaller ones can't compete. So how can housing, especially when there's such a governmental issue, I guess, in kind of going, right, well, if you're going to build all this stock, make some of it private rent and some of it for sale so that you can keep going, and that's how you're going to afford X, Y, Z over the next few years. But if you can't get the site in the first place, then how are you meant to do it? Richard, let me bring you back in. Thank you for being patient.
That's all right. I just wanted to say a couple of things, really. But before I say that, just firstly, I agree with everything that Alison just said. But just for the record, the kind of, the merger's bad, small community organisations good isn't necessarily always the case, just for the record, because one of the organisations I used to work for was very good at merging with distressed housing associations. So had they not intervened, then that housing association, at least 2 of them would have got bankrupt, basically. So there is a place for large, financially wealthy housing associations that can step in and rescue distressed organisations. So, there is a place for that. I just wondered, my second point really is I just wondered about the kind of professionalisation of the service, because with the passage of the white paper through Parliament at the moment, I think the House of Lords has posted an amendment around how housing staff need to be professionally trained and qualified. And I just wonder, I think that's good in theory. I just wondered how geared up the sector is to professionalise itself, if that makes sense. I guess there might be a huge demand all of a sudden on the CIH.
We actually ran I'll get you the recording sent over. You can find it, and I can see Michelle Haycock smiling actually, because I know you were there. I ran a roundtable on this only a couple of months ago, actually, with Emily Orme she was at the time with Housing Solutions. She's since moved on. There were 53 people on that roundtable. It was a massive debate, and the outcome seemed to be along the lines of, by the end of it, housing needs to be qualified in some way, shape or form. People need to get a qualification from an ownership perspective, but also from a professionalization perspective, but that shouldn't ever be a barrier to people entering the industry who aren't involved in it. But if you've been a housing officer or a manager or whatever it will be, each level needs to have a qualification, but that you can obtain that whilst in the role. You don't necessarily have to get it, but the CIH does need to play a big part in that. But whatever legislation goes through, housing providers need to be involved in it. And I think that's where some of the concern is at the moment, is these decisions will be made before anybody in housing actually gets to say. But the recording is available. If you join the, if you're not already on it, please join the LinkedIn group. But there's a couple of months ago, and I can send you over the direct link, because it was a debate that ran and seemed to only last minutes, and yet it was about an hour and a half. It was really interesting. I can get that sent over. Before I bring Nigel back in, Claire, Fouracre, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on some of the topics that have come up and your, from your experience, where this idea of, because I really like the fact that Richard brought up, there is a place for larger organisations, and the amount of nods in the room was clear for supporting distressed houses, for just smaller businesses, because, and this is why I made that caveat at the beginning, I didn't want this being just a bashing of, oh, well, smaller is better, because there has to be, those support networks in place as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think I've been sort of nodding along. I think I'm becoming a bit like a nodding dog in the back of the cars, really, between Alice and Richard. I think, from my experience of larger, smaller, and I think personally, I'm probably slightly, with Alison and Richard in terms of the smaller offering and the accountability and the ownership that bring. But do recognise that absolutely there is a place for, the larger organisations and that rescue sort of side of merger and acquisitions, and it's necessary ultimately, isn't it? And again, in sort of preparing for today, I sort of had looking at some examples of mergers, and I think it was up in the north somewhere, but there was this thing about the number of properties they could develop moving forward. So it went from 15 to maybe 250 in a local area, because a smaller organisation just couldn't sustain the local need. And without that larger organisation them forming together, it just wasn't possible for that to continue. And, it's that type of thing that, okay, the housing management side is one element of customer service, but that local ongoing need from local communities is important as well, isn't it? So yeah, I think there's no straight answer to this, is there? And that's sort of the interesting part of this debate, really, is,
But I think it's always about remembering, and this is sometimes where it's got a bit lost, is the impact it has on customers is huge and will continue to be. And actually, I've seen debates recently about whether or not customers is even the right term. So, but certainly on a customer service, there are too many stories coming out at the moment, I guess, about some very large, and we're talking about the largest RPs out there, letting down customers and not necessarily dealing with that in the best way. However, on the flip side, as Carolyn has mentioned in the chat there, we must also recognise there are opportunities for staff to develop their careers following a merger. And actually, it's exactly the same with large organisations. If you're in a small community provider, it can get a bit dead man's shoes. So you need places where people can learn more skills and get a chance to step up and through. But that culture of customer service, I think it's beginning to show itself a little bit more obvious amongst, no matter the size of the company and how important that is. Nigel, let me bring you back in.
Yes, thank you. I mean, Richard and Claire make the point that not all acquisitions are bad. Certainly in terms of financial viability, it's obviously a good business decision to do that. But notwithstanding, these new regulations should not be negated or minimised, because they're going to have an equal effect as much as the V rating by the regulators. So it goes back to this conundrum of customer service and financial viability, and it's a great discussion to have. But there is absolutely no doubt in my mind with my own landlord that they are facing scaling up issues to resource this, which is why I go back to the resource issue, to ensure they comply with these new regulations. They know they've not got, they've got to get on with it now, not in 18 months. So I think it's a great topic that you've got there, Matthew. And I don't know what the solution is, but it's a great topic for discussion. And thank God I'm not a landlord.
I think it's one of those where no matter what gets brought to the round table, the idea is that there isn't always a very straight answer, but that it's something that the sector needs to be talking about more openly. And actually, I've spoken to a few people who are in some way affiliated with the CIH that have said, we love the debate, we'll watch the recording back, probably can't be there today because of, I guess, the standpoint sometimes that's made, because they don't want to be talking out against certain RPs or anything along those lines, or the customer service that goes with it. But similarly, I raised a debate on whether or not it should come forward along the lines of whether or not housing associations need to be having their awards nights this year and the big CIH awards and that kind of stuff. And actually, a lot of people are going, absolutely not, because this is the cost of living crisis and everything that goes with it. But it does go against what businesses like the CIH want to do, and the money and the fundraising that comes with it. But I thought there are other ways to fundraise. A whole nother debate there, but debates like this, and I like the fact that we haven't got a clear-cut answer, because there's never going to be one. But I think what needs to be clear is that there is a true sense of and true culture of customer service going through any business that is going to merge, and understanding that customer service culture is another thing that needs to have its due diligence done on it, because just going, oh, well, we do X, Y, Z isn't enough. I think it might have been Nigel, it might have been Richard who mentioned earlier, if you're going to change patch sizes, you need to be talking to your residents about the negatives of that and what might happen and what you might lose, but equally what you might gain, because, it will be, you might get less contact, but that you're going to have a more dedicated team rather than a one particular person, or whatever that looks like. And it's a difficult one. It is a difficult one, but certainly not a conversation we should be shying away from. Has anyone kind of got any last? I appreciate we've nearly run out of time already, which is mad. But has anyone got any kind of questions they'd like to raise before? Yes, Richard, please do.
Yeah, it's a shame I haven't got more time really. Be good to have a discussion actually as part of this around tenant activism, because there's a lot of tenant activism going on at the moment that's driving kind of bad press or whatever through social media and impacting on the reputation of the sector. So I think I look at tenant activism as a kind of a continuation actually from something that used to go on sort of 30 years ago, which was all around defend council housing. So that whole movement has obviously kind of dissipated, but I still see echoes of it in tenant activism these days. And I don't think the sector has really we haven't got our head around that really. And the potential impact that tenant activism has and should have, I think is a good thing. But I think we need, as a sector, we need to embrace it. And I see too many kind of, don't talk to the hand kind of responses to tenant activists. And I think as a sector, we haven't cracked that particular nut yet. Just going back to the awards thing, my view is that the sector's been timid on awards for years. I don't think they're appropriate. They're particularly not appropriate at the moment, and I don't actually see the benefit that they provide, because I've not learned any particular good practice from an award ceremony. I've learned good practice from talking to other people, but not through an award ceremony. So I
No, absolutely. And I know a few people who've gone towards nights that now their teams have stopped going because they say it's the same teams win every year, the same businesses win every year. Why would I keep going? And yeah, that's definitely a discussion I want to bring to the table, but it's finding someone who's willing to kind of go, yeah, I want to bring this to the table, because it's a difficult one. And I never want this to be a very one-sided conversation. I always want it to be able to have a kind of very honest discussion from both sides of it, which I feel we've done today. Claire, any last kind of thoughts from yourself? Because obviously, you and I talked about this, and it's a debate, like I said, we could go on and on and on about this, and I think the sector needs to. But there's a real challenge now, and now is the time that, you know, I think Richard mentioned there, now is the time, as did Nigel, that we need to be acting on these things. But as ever, the large, and this I guess is the other side, the larger the organisation, the longer it takes to actually make change and for something to happen.
Yeah, I think sort of my sort of closing thoughts, it remains an interesting conversation, and probably one that needs a lot more exploration. You know, it feels like this has been, the last of my life probably. So there's probably a lot more, we could go a lot more into detail, especially that housing management side and the services that customers receive and scales of organisations and communication. It almost lends itself to other types of debates, doesn't it, really? But I think given what probably the sector is facing, I think there will remain a need, that's clear, and I think it will be something that we perhaps see more of in the future. That's my personal view on that. But I think we've got this interesting kind of new angle, really, in terms of the involvement of customers. Not that it wasn't there previously, but there is sort of that regulation coming, or the legislation down the line, isn't there? That sort of white paper. And I think the point Rich has just made about the tenant activism, that's a sort of, feel like a more, maybe not so, you know, I acknowledge what you're saying, Richard, about the defending council housing, but it's a different kind of a newer sort of area, isn't it, that complicates things slightly and something to be considered. So I think it's probably just the climate in which these things are going is slightly different, although it should have always been there and should have always been considerations, but there's things to make sure it most is now, which hopefully might bring about some change in how successful future mergers and acquisitions are. It's a hope anyway. So
it certainly is, and I think there's a big need for it to do so. And I know I did get a message from Jo apologising. Her whole culture of, she runs a business called Big Picture Training, and that whole training culture is on is customer service in line with the culture of the business. And she would have, you know, and definitely talked to me before about exactly what you've mentioned there, which is that when a business is small, you understand the culture. When it gets big, it's, well, what is, sometimes finding your culture is sometimes the first step. And in housing at the moment, if our culture isn't focused on our customers and good customer service, then things are going wrong. Appreciate a couple of people had to go, and a couple of people are messaging saying going to have to. So thank you everybody for coming today. Do join you can just search the Social Housing Roundtable on LinkedIn at the top. There's a group page there that's got the recording of this and all of the other ones. If anyone ever needs recruitment help, these are always free, and the reason they're free is because they're backed up by my recruitment business. Put the teeth in. I set up on my own nearly 2 years ago to get away from that traditional agency method, and so far going well. So happy to support anybody, but mainly a massive thank you to Claire and to everyone else who could come along today. Claire, thank you for bringing this discussion to the table. It's clearly one that we could have run with for many hours, and no doubt we'll bring up again in the new year. I am looking for conversations and topics for the new year at the moment, so I definitely think there's something here we can do. But as I say, thank you to everybody who could come today, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next event. The next roundtable is on Tuesday with Laura Bryan. A different one. So she runs a nutrition business that syncs with a lot of housing providers, talking about how mental health and nutrition are so closely linked in social housing, particularly amongst trades and staff in places like call centres. So it should be a really interesting one. So hopefully see you there. Until then, take care everybody, and thank you for joining this week. Cheers.